The average American adult is apparently worth over $620,000. If you just felt a small, uncomfortable jolt reading that, like you're somehow behind, like everyone else quietly has a small fortune, you don't take a breath. That number is technically true. It's also one of the most misleading statistics in personal finance, and once you understand why, you'll never look at a headline like that the same way again. By the end of this video, you'll know the actual number that matters, why the 600,000 figure exists at all, and exactly where you really stand compared to everyone else. Here's the thing about that statistic. It's real. According to a major global wealth report, the average wealth per adult in the United States sits above $600,000, one of the highest average wealth figures of any country on earth. But average is doing an enormous amount of quiet, dishonest work in that sentence. Think about what an average actually is. You take every single person's net worth, add it all together, and divide by the number of people. That sounds fair. It isn't, because it assumes wealth is spread out roughly evenly across the population. It's not spread out evenly at all. And when one number in a group is enormous, it drags the entire average up with it, even if almost nobody else is anywhere close to that number. Here's a way to see this instantly. Imagine 10 people sitting in a room. 9 of them each have $10,000. The 10th person is a billionaire. Add it all up, divide by 10, and the average net worth in that room is over $100 million per person. Every single person in that room, except one, would look at that number and think, that's not me. That's not even close to me. But statistically, it's completely accurate. It's just not describing anyone's actual life. This is exactly what's happening with the $600,000 figure. It's not describing the typical American. It's describing a mathematical average that includes an extremely small number of extremely wealthy people whose net worth is so large it distorts the entire calculation. So what actually tells you where a typical person stands? A different statistic entirely, the median. The median doesn't average anything together. It simply lines every single person up from poorest to richest and finds whoever's standing exactly in the middle. Half the population has more than that person. Half has less. No billionaire sitting at the far end of the line can drag that middle point very far, because position in a line, unlike a sum, doesn't care how extreme the outlier is. And here's where the real number becomes genuinely useful to you personally. If your net worth is above roughly $124,000, you are, statistically, wealthier than half of all adults in the country. Not the average person. The actual middle. That's the number that tells you something real about where you stand. Notice the gap between these two numbers. $620,000 versus $124,000. That's not a small rounding difference. That's a 5 times difference between the average and the actual middle of the pack, and that gap itself is the real headline, even though it's the part almost nobody reports. So why is the gap between those two numbers so large, specifically in the United States? Because wealth here is unusually concentrated at the very top. A relatively small number of extremely wealthy individuals hold an enormous share of total national wealth. Every time headlines report on that handful of people gaining hundreds of billions of dollars in a single year, that gain gets folded directly into the average calculation for every single adult in the country, even though none of that money touches the bank account of a typical person watching the news. This is why average American wealth headlines can rise dramatically in a given year, even during a period when a huge number of ordinary families are simultaneously reporting rising bankruptcy filings, rising credit card debt, and stalled progress toward things like buying a first home. Both things are true at once. The average goes up. The median barely moves. And most people only ever see the first number. There's a psychological cost to all of this that's worth naming directly: comparison anxiety built on a broken number. When people see a huge average wealth figure and quietly measure themselves against it, they're not comparing themselves to a real, achievable target. They're comparing themselves to a mathematical artifact shaped by a tiny sliver of extreme outliers. That's a recipe for feeling perpetually behind, even while making genuinely solid, steady financial progress. This matters because the feeling of being behind isn't neutral. It can push people toward exactly the kind of behavior that actually does damage, chasing speculative investments to catch up, feeling shame around normal financial struggles, or avoiding honest conversations about money because the bar in your head was set impossibly high by a statistic that was never describing you in the first place. So what do you actually do with this information? First, when you see a big, round, headline-grabbing wealth statistic, get in the habit of asking one quiet question. Is this an average, or is this a median? That single word changes the entire meaning of the number. Second, use the median, the actual middle of the pack, as your real point of comparison, not because it's a target to worship, but because it's an honest one. It tells you something true about where a typical person actually stands without a handful of extreme outliers quietly rewriting the story. Third, remember that your own financial progress should be measured against your own starting point and your own goals, not against a number engineered by a small number of enormous fortunes sitting at the very top of a very long, very uneven line. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Most of the average wealth headlines you'll ever see aren't lying to you exactly. They're just describing something almost nobody actually experiences, dressed up to look like a normal, relatable fact about everyday life. The people who stop feeling quietly behind aren't the ones who found a way to hit $620,000 overnight. They're the ones who learned to ask which number they were actually being compared to in the first place. You just learned to ask that question too.